Welcome to the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of RocketPD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
And, most people are silent but reasonable, right? Most people want their kids to be safe. They want them to be happy. They want a response from an administrator when there's the teacher when there's a problem.
There's no doubt about it. We're living in one of the most politically and culturally divisive times in recent memory. Nowhere is that more visible than in America's public schools. Students, principals, and teachers are being asked to navigate these tensions every single day while still somehow trying to move their communities forward. My guest today, Dr. Josh Starr, knows this challenge intimately.
When they see the leader only attending to the haters, to the bad behavior, it's kind of like in the classroom. If you're disciplining the one student, it's not just about that one kid, it's about the 25 other kids. They're seeing what's Corey going to put up with, right? And you got to do the same thing. So you can't just spend all your time dealing with the fringes.
As a former superintendent and a national education leader, now the founder of Common Ground Solutions, Josh has spent years helping school and district leaders find common purpose in their work. In this conversation, we talk about how leaders can build trust, create clarity, and bring people together around shared values without backing down from what matters most.
You also have to be able to engage with and message to the silent but reasonable people that, hey, this is why we're going, this is where we're going, this is why we're going there, this is how we're going to get there, and I need you to do it with me together.
If you're leading in a tough environment, this episode is for you. So let's get into it. Hey, Josh, good to have you back on the podcast. We're talking about unity, and I think you and I can both agree, probably everyone listening on to this podcast can probably agree, we are living in a time, one of the most divisive times probably in history, probably that you and I can remember. Educators are in a lot of ways struggling to understand, where they fit in, how they can be effective. Can you talk to me? Because I know this is something that you've studied, you've written about. How do we find common ground when we're living in a time of such divisiveness, of such disagreement? And, the kids, unfortunately, are kind of stuck in the middle here.
You start with yourself. When I was coming up and learning from some of the best urban superintendents out there. This is late 90s, early 2000s when I was in grad school. And one of the things that my mentor, Bob Peterkin, may rest in peace, he says, you got to find the hill you're going to die on. And in this notion of great leaders are, they charge up the hill, they know what the work is, particularly when it comes to school transformation, when it comes to equity, when it comes to serving the most vulnerable kids. And you got to be willing to lose your job. And there's some truth to that, right? There's some truth to that. And I appreciated it. And yet I've seen how leaders in the education space who do that lose their job and then move on to the next one. And nothing changes for kids. And you have to find this balance between your core. What is it that I know to be true and real, that is important, that are my values? You got to know yourself. But then how am I going to invite other people into the process of actually organizing collective effort around it? Because otherwise, you're just standing on the mountaintop all by yourself and shouting from on high. And you may be right that we need to do X, Y, or Z, that, reading scores are atrocious or, whatever it may be. But if you don't figure out a way as a leader to get people behind that vision, it's just a vision, right? Without the execution. And now I think we're seeing more than ever that the skills, and they are real skills, they're learned skills that are required to bring people into a collective conversation about how to improve our public schools and how to serve our kids, particularly most vulnerable ones. It's more important now than ever. And that's just the work that I think we need to do and that I love doing with folks out there.
You mentioned sort of being up there, and if you're up there all alone, it's just a vision, right? I've heard you talk about this idea of clarity, right? How do you express your vision in a way that's clear and purposeful so that you can get people organized? I think we'd probably agree, and most people listening to this podcast would probably agree that, like, from a vision standpoint, we understand and believe in the impact of public education, but kind of organizing around this idea of how do we pivot or change so that we can be effective in this new environment is foreign to a lot of educators. We don't quite understand how to operate now.
Yeah, so I was just working with a team, a cabinet, great leader who I've known for years, and I was working with their team. And one of the things I asked them is, like, when you're done with your meeting, is it clear who needs to do what by when to actually make this happen? And are you able to raise your hand and say to the superintendent, hey, you know what? I actually don't know what I'm supposed to do. Again, so that's actually about, and I know this sort of sounds almost like pedestrian or small, but like meeting design. Did I design the meeting in a way that it's really clear why we're here, what we're doing, how the decision's being made? That's a learned skill. I know where I learned it, right? I learned it from my mentor, one of my mentors, Larry Leverett, right? So do you design the meeting in a way that has very clear metrics and accountability and timelines? Do you then have when you're doing your one-on-one meetings with your team, do they understand what it is that you're going to do to support them, what the accountability is? And the reason I'm starting with the cabinet is because it trickles down, right? It becomes this big game of telephone in school districts. If you say to your assistant soup for elementary one thing, they interpret it one way, and your assistant soup for, curriculum interprets it another way, well, then messages get, they get unclear, obfuscated, right? So I know that sounds like a simple sort of small thing, like start with meeting design. Is your culture such that your team feels comfortable saying, hey, Corey, you know what? This isn't going to work. Here's how we can make it work, but this isn't going to work. Or maybe we should, or does the leader, everyone just supposed to follow the leader's orders regardless? You have a culture we can really engage in that kind of conversation. Are you willing to have hard conversations about what's working and what's not? Those are the kinds of the leadership capacities that we see in leaders who get results, but they need to be taught. You have to learn them. And that's what we're trying to do. And what I'm trying to do at Common Ground Solutions is to say, these are learned skills. Active listening. Too often when people are talking to each other, think about this the next time you're having a conversation with somebody. You're already creating your response when they've just started talking. How do you have the internal capacity with deep breathing with everybody to say, okay, I'm really going to listen to Corey before I craft my response? Little things like that's a learned practice skill. So those are the kinds of things that I think I know leaders need more of, and that I'm working with them on at Common Ground.
That's interesting. As you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, I'm doing that right now, right? I'm thinking.
Well, it's different when you're a journalist, right?
What's the next question I was going to ask in this call? I should be listening to what Josh has to say. I couldn't agree with you more. And I do think that's a learned skill. One of the things that you often talk about, and then I've heard you talk about, is like, we know we have divisions. And like we can listen to each other to try to, sow those divisions. But how do we get to a point of shared purpose, right? I can tweak my meetings, I can listen, but I still need to get my community organized and moving in the right direction. And by the way, right, this goes beyond my cabinet. It goes beyond even all the way down to the buildings, all the way out to the parents, the business community, everyone who's supporting the school district. And so that shared purpose, man, that's a big thing.
Yeah. So I think it's a couple things. One is absolute clarity around your vision and absolute transparency around how you intend to get there. And integrity in the decision-making process. Here's where we need to go. And here's how folks are going to be involved in it, whether it's strategic planning, you think about there's all these different complicated things that leaders have to deal with in school systems or nonprofits for that matter. And how are you saying, okay, here's where we're going, here's how we're going to do it together, and then actually follow through. That's one. Two is listen to your resistors. Sometimes your resistors can become your biggest allies if they are brought into the conversation in a way that gives them an opportunity to communicate what their concerns may be, because sometimes those concerns are really legitimate. Now, that being said, you also have to know how to disregard your haters. And there are some people that shouldn't be at the table. And, most people are silent but reasonable. Right. Most people want their kids to be safe. They want them to be happy. They want a response from an administrator when there's the teacher when there's a problem. And when they see the leader only attending to the haters, to the bad behavior, it's kind of like in the classroom. If you're disciplining the one student, it's not just about that one kid. It's about the 25 other kids. They're seeing what's Corey going to put up with, right? And you got to do the same thing. So you can't just spend all your time dealing with the fringes. You also have to be able to engage with and message to the silent but reasonable people that, hey, this is why we're going. This is where we're going. This is why we're going there. This is how we're going to get there. And I need you to do it with me together. So they can kind of trust that you've got some integrity in the process. And then you got to surround yourself with whether it's some people call it the kitchen cabinet or just the advisors who are going to tell you the truth. And that's where I think a lot of leaders are, I don't want to say afraid. That's not they're hesitant sometimes to be really transparent and open it up because it's hard. It's hard to say, hey, what am I not doing right? What did I miss? Give me some real feedback. You're expected when you're a superintendent of schools or you're a nonprofit exec and you're running with your board, you got to have all the answers. You're expected to have all the expertise to be able to say, I don't know. Here's how we're going to get there. Here's how I'm going to get there. That's hard. You got to practice that. You got to open that up. But it means you got to create a culture where people will give you real feedback.
I've heard people say, at the top levels of school districts, leadership is a lonely thing, right? You're out there on an island in some ways. But I also hear you saying it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? If you have people who you can trust and bring into conversations, people always say, well, it's courageous to be a leader, or you're out there again, staking your flag in the ground. But isn't inspiring courage in others even more courageous in a lot of ways? And how do you get to that point, right? I'm a leader, I'm out here on an island, but I've stood out there, I've staked my flag, but that's just the first step. Now I've got to get other people to row in this direction. How do you inspire that same courage in your organization?
Well, there's a bunch of different things you said there. So in terms of leadership being lonely, it is in some ways. And you do have to be willing to ensure that the people who are around you are the right people, regardless of how you feel about them. And leaders, typically the top leaders only get to make the bad decisions. Nobody comes to the superintendent of schools to get to do the fun stuff. Right. And they're doing it either because they don't want to make a decision or they don't know how to make a decision or they're stuck. And so oftentimes you have to make the unpopular decisions. And sometimes, focusing on the good of the organization is always the most important thing. And that can be lonely and you have to be willing to stand up for it. The other part of that, though, I think to your question is about inspiring folks. Part of it is through clarity around where you're going and why you're going. A lot of it is around authenticity as well. And I learned this when I was in my first superintendency, because I started young. I was 35 and I was the data guy and I was the guy who was going to read and, all that kind of stuff. And I did that. And I realized, though, that my lack of authenticity with people was hurting me. I was a little too reserved and I needed to just be more approachable and open up. And once I did it, it helped a lot. People got to know me as a person in ways that they hadn't. And I was a little hesitant to do that at first, to kind of show my true self. And once I was really authentic with folks, they got behind it. Not everybody, you're going to have people who are going to resist. But I think the level of authenticity and clarity, people want to know you. They want to know your story. They want to know your values, and you got to share it with them. And then you also have to do what you say you're going to do. If you say you're going to do it, do it. Then they'll trust you and they'll say, okay, this guy is for real. Even if they don't like the decision, if they understand why it's been made, they'll say, okay, I can trust that they're going to do what needs to be done to serve our kids.
It's really interesting you said that, because I was looking at this just now, this notion of like, a leadership position means that you're going to have and express your vision. To your point, people may or may not agree with your decision, but you're hoping that through the relationships you're building, they're going to get behind that. People have different perspectives. I mean, let's face it, in an organization of 5 people, you probably have 5 different perspectives. In an organization of 5,000 or 10,000 or more, who knows how many different perspectives exist within that organization. You're not asking everybody as a leader of a school system to have the same perspective. In fact, the opposite. How do you bring all of those different
So what people do have, though, are shared interests. And so interests are not what you want, but why you want them. One of the examples I use all the time is class size, right? We debate over class size all the time, even though the evidence on small classes being more effective is scant at best. But it's the third rail of the superintendency, small class sizes, and it's the symbolic issue that everyone can get around. But when you actually ask people, well, why? Why do you want small classes? Well, reduce caseload, reduce workload for the teacher, more individualized attention, right? Less disruptive behavior, whatever it may. Those are shared interests. We all want that. So the leader has to be able to say, okay, what are your interests? What do we value here together? We want safe schools. We want our kids to be happy. We want our kids to be learning at a high level. Now, let me come back with you and show you how we're going to get there, what the spending plan is going to be, what their professional learning plan, like whatever it may be to get there. But let's not debate over 26 kids or 23 kids in a class. Let's debate over how we're going to make sure that every child gets the kind of personalized attention they're going to need, how a teacher's workload is going to be, manageable, right? That's the more important conversation. And too often we fight on positions, right? And not enough on interests. And again, this is one of the things that I was very fortunate to learn this stuff very explicitly from my mentor, and then put it into practice, particularly when I was in Montgomery County. Like we had we were deeply committed to interest-based negotiations, and I had learned how to do it. I was trained in it. If you're not trained in that stuff, you can't be expected to do it, just by, you can't make this stuff up. That's why teaching leaders these skills, these are real skills. And that's what I think is necessary and frankly missing in a lot of leadership development work these days.
Speaking of leadership development work, I know that you've recently started your own organization at Common Ground Solutions. We got back, at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about sort of the divisiveness that's out there right now in the space and how challenging it makes it to operate. But this idea and this notion that if we can find common ground, we can be successful. Can you talk to me a little bit about, number one, tell me about the name, why Common Ground? And then number two, let's talk about some of the things that you're working with districts on.
Sure. When I decided that I wanted to lean into my consulting work and the leadership development work that I love doing, I realized that the most important factor in being able to implement and sustain a transformation agenda that actually serves every single child in the way that they deserve requires collective effort. It requires that your team, your board, your stakeholders, your teachers, everybody is organized together around shared values, common goals, and shared interests. And so when I thought about the work that I want to do, that's really what I want to focus on. How do you do that kind of work? And I also think that there are, given the national rhetoric going on, given what we're seeing these days, which is so disheartening and so challenging. I do think that I know that it's hamstringing some superintendents, some nonprofits leaders who really want to do the right work and are working hard, but they don't know exactly how to navigate it. And there's some others who are doing fabulous work in this area and teaching people. I look at Jen Cheatham and I look at Amanda Ripley, Kathy Ansett. Like, there's some really good people who are tackling this work that I think is really important, and raising this question of, like, actually conflict can be good, right? Superintendents are political operators. I want to get down to the level of, like, okay, here are the skills, right? Here are the learned skills that you need in these difficult times to be able to have the conversation when not everybody in the community is of the same perspective. And some people are really emboldened to speak out in some very difficult ways. What do you do? What's a strategy? That's what I want to help leaders really organize and implement.
As we were exchanging back and forth, you wrote something down. It says common ground is a choice, right? It's not about surrendering your values here. It's about building bridges without backing down. Talk to me about.
That was pretty smart. Who wrote that? Are you sure I wrote that? It wasn't like a ChatGPT thing, man?
No, I got it right here.
Yeah. Oof. All right. Yeah, it's right. I mean, it's a choice, and it's a hard choice too, particularly. And I've been in this situation so many times where you work so hard with your team on an issue. You're ready to go. You think you have the solution. You spend time and energy, and then people resist, and you're like, it's really easy to dismiss them. And I've done that before to my detriment. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes you, and I can tell you stories about where I said, just say no, because it's got to be done, even though you're going to get enemies. But it's so hard to recognize that other people don't see what you see. They don't necessarily trust what the information that you're looking at. They haven't been through it. They're not spending 24/7 thinking about the issue, and to then have the strength to say, and the skills to say, okay, well, I think this is the right solution for us. Let's stress test it with stakeholders. Let's put it out there to make sure it's right, and maybe we have to pivot in order to make it successful. That's really hard. That's pragmatic radicalism in some ways that I think is essential, but it ain't easy.
Yeah, no, for sure. I got to ask you, if I'm a superintendent, either been in my role for a little while, but really struggling with, just sort of the tenor and the, prevailing just, again, divisiveness that we've seen in our communities, or if I'm stepping in to a role maybe for the first time or in a new district, what do I have to do to get started kind of laying that foundation for common ground so that we can build from that place? Josh.
You mean after you've read my book, right?
After you've read, yes, I should put this up on the screen.
And the reason I bring that up is because there are entry points. Part of it is about particularly if you're new, transitioning into an organization and how you tell your story and how you activate other people's stories and how you create a collective shared story about what the context is and the vision is and the strengths of the community and of the organization you're going into. And then you have to figure out what your entry point is. Is it teaching and learning? Is it culture? Is it resources? Is it talent? Like what are the things that you need to start focusing on that you can then organize collective effort around? One of the things that I did when I was in my first superintendency really activated teacher leadership to help us think through what the next level of our curriculum and our teaching. So it's like, you gotta be really intentional about, okay, here's where I think we can make some progress quickly. And then here's a process for actually getting people to be part of it. And it's the second piece that I think some folks struggle with. And the other piece is leaders think they have to do everything at once. And they are pressured by the board, they're pressured by the community, and they themselves see all these issues. The best leaders, and one of the things I try to teach people to do, is they slow down the inquiry to speed up the action. But they do it very publicly, very transparently, and say, we're gonna, it's not that we're gonna stop the trains, but we're gonna take a really deep look at what's urgent versus what's important. And I'm gonna make decisions based on what's urgent, not and you're gonna know why we're funding this next year and not that. But I gotta be able to step back and really understand the real problem I'm trying to solve, and not just jump at the list of stuff, because leaders always have lists of stuff. And it's easy to just keep going down that list, checking off the boxes. They ain't got a new list. And you feel like that's productivity, but it's just activity. It's motion. It's not movement. And learning how to slow down the inquiry to speed up the action is a really important sort of skill set and process that I think leaders need to engage in.
I love that idea, and I want to talk to you about one more idea, and I kind of mentioned it at the outset of this conversation, but I keep thinking about, as I've been traveling around the country and talking to school leaders, this notion that, there is some fear out there right now. Superintendent tenures have actually been creeping up a little bit, but they're still pretty
because people don't want to move, right?
Right.
If they've got a good thing, why go somewhere?
Yeah. That's true. And despite that, I feel like there is this notion of, again, I don't want to move. I don't want to lose my job. How far am I willing to go in the environment that I'm in? You said you can't be afraid to lose your job. Tell me a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah. And I say that because that's sort of what that's how I was raised, so to speak, when I was coming up as a soup. But you should be afraid to lose your job in some ways, because, look, this is part of the structure of it. Most people have been in the same state. You don't want to lose your pension, right? You want to be able to get another job in the state that you're in. So there's real, and it's there's a personal aspect to it as well. So you have to be really intentional and deliberate about where the community is. The superintendent is the steward for the community's values as manifest through the election of a board of education. And you can only go so far as they're going to let you. And that's one of the humbling aspects. Now, part of your job as a soup is to teach and cajole and to inspire and organize, but you're only going to be able to go as far as they let you. And you have to really understand that.
Josh, thank you for chatting with me about this. I always love talking to you. Great having you back on the podcast. And hopefully we'll get to talk again real soon.
Yeah, likewise. Always great talking to you, Corey. Keep up the great work that you guys are doing at Rocket.
Appreciate it, Josh. Take care. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the RocketPD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for RocketPD. At RocketPD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at rocketpd.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.